Today's big show is going to cover urbanization. Between 1816 and 1900, the number and size of American cities grew tremendously. For example, the population of New York City grew from 800,000 in 1860 to 3.5 million in 1900. And in Chicago, it grew from 109,000 in 1860 to 1.6 million 40 years later. For a little context, in 1980, the population of the state of Iowa was 3.2 million. And today, the population of the state of Iowa is about 3.2 million, maybe 3.3 million. Hasn't changed much in 40 years. It's also smaller than the population of New York City was in 1900. In the United States, in 1840, the U.S. had 131 cities with a population of 2,500 people or more. By 1900, that number had climbed to 1,700 cities with a population of 2,500 or more. Most newly arrived immigrants, as well as many rural Americans, moved to cities during this time period. And there's a number of significant changes that took place during this time. To accommodate the increase in population, some cities got taller. They built skyscrapers and buildings got significantly taller. Mass transit. To accommodate the increase in population, cities began to build electric commuter trains. The picture you see there is actually of the elevated train known as the L in Chicago. There's also trolley cars which rode along the streets and subways. This is a picture of New York City subway from that time period. But it wasn't just cities in New York or Chicago, other big cities. Des Moines had a trolley system. Here's a picture of downtown Des Moines in 1910. And there was also the Des Moines Urbandale Trolley. Now, if you want to know where the Urbandale Trolley went to, if you go down 70th Street, and there's like a little park that has these white cutouts of individuals and in this little grassy area, right before it curves and becomes Urbandale Avenue, that's where the turnaround was. It was a turntable, and so the whole trolley car would spin around to head back towards Des Moines. Commuter trains allowed wealthier people, first rich people and later middle class people, to live outside the city that was being built up by increased in immigrants coming from other countries and poorer people moving there. So they moved out. And I want to give you a little description of how that happened even in Des Moines. The map you're looking at is off the Ingersoll area. You can see Ingersoll Avenue located in the bottom half of the picture. It's running east and west or horizontally across the page. And so downtown would be to the right edge, not pictured in the map. And this is an area that's kind of over by where Roosevelt High School is. Now, before 1900, these were just farm fields. Nothing particularly was there. In fact, in around 1900, out in this area, they would have circuses would come by once a year and set up there. There's just big open fields. But by the early 1900s, that would change. This home was built in 1907. This home was built in 1910. In 1914, and there's a whole bunch of houses like this that still stand there, really nice homes, at the end of Ingersoll Avenue. There was this example of that was actually off a commuter line. So the Urbandale Des Moines line went up right up the middle of Urbandale Avenue, commuter train, trolley car, and that's how people got to their jobs downtown and back home. Here's a house built in 1915. And 1916, and because there were more and more people there, that's when Roosevelt High School was built in 1924, which is just by there. Even in Des Moines, this urbanization, this buildup of cities, and then rich people moving away from the downtown where immigrants were moving into, further out into the neighborhoods we're kind of used to seeing today, suburban areas. Enormous growth in city populations was caused in large part by immigration. Lots and lots of people, even in Des Moines, people moving here. The enormous growth in city population increased the demand for public services like fire departments. Here's a picture of a New York City fire department from about around 1900. It caused a large growth of police departments. You need more police with more people. The growth in city population caused an increased demand on the public services like sanitation departments. Here's a street cleaner. And it caused the construction of new bridges. As people were commuting and driving more and more. And with increase in cities, people desire to have green spaces, so they built parks. And a construction of lots of new schools. Public schools became much more common after 1900. It also required the construction of new sewer systems. Here is a sewer system being put in. You can see it's actually where the street is going to be. And new electrical systems. These are big turbines that generate electricity. You have all these gadgets we've learned about previously, and now you have electricity go to people's homes. Interestingly enough, the major storm, the derecho we had in August, dismantled or tore apart some of the grid systems. Some of the grid system was as old as the time period we're talking about, was first put down more than 100 years ago. One reason why it was so vulnerable to storms like that. In the city core, we see lots of tenements, poorly built apartment buildings for poor people, where people would be crammed in. The tenements would be within walking distance of huge factories and huge amount of pollution from factories. And the residents of tenements tended to be immigrants. That's because that's who worked in these factories. And richer people, as you saw just a little bit ago, would ride the commuter trains to get out of downtown, away from where the factories were, and to the more suburban areas. And tenements had lots of raw sewage and piles of garbage littered streets. It was difficult to keep up with the mess. These problems in urban areas led to political machines. That's an organization linked to a political party that often controlled local government. The political machines were controlled by party bosses. This is the person in charge of the political machine. In exchange for votes, political machines and the party bosses who ran them eagerly provided jobs and housing and sanitation and fire and police protection that people needed. But the cost of that was known as graft. The acquisition of money in dishonest ways, as in bribing a politician. Party bosses controlled the city finances. Many machine politicians grew very rich as a result of fraud or graft, gaining power illegally. The political machines controlled by party bosses allowed some people to get very rich at the expense of all of the taxpayers, but they did supply some services for all of the poor people moving into the cities. And that's your big show on urbanization.